Hello, and welcome to Human Evolution. Today I want to talk about how we think about all of these things that we're going to talk about. And one of the really big things that we like to do as humans is we like to organize things. And the reason that we do this is because it allows us, one, to see patterns, to make sense of the world around us. And two, it allows us to think about large amounts of information in a coherent, cohesive way. So to start off with, I want to talk about geologic time and how we actually organize the history of the Earth. So really when we do this, we're talking about thinking about it in two different ways. Relative time and chronologic time, right? And so when we talk about relative dating, for instance, and we'll talk about this when we talk about fossils, we're talking about dating something in relation to something else. And so we place events in a sequence based on other events in the sequence, right? Whereas a chronologic dating is a determination of the actual age. And really to come up with our geologic timescale, we do both of those things, right? And so we rely heavily on both relative and absolute. Chronologic is also sometimes called, when you talk about dating, it's called absolute. But when we look at time, this is sort of just a little overview, and I actually like this. You do not have to memorize any of this stuff, but I like this because it gives you all of the eons, which are the biggest divisions, and then it gives you the eras, the periods, and that I really like. And then periods are actually divided into epochs as you move closer towards the present, and then epochs are divided into ages. And again, I don't want you to memorize this, right? We're going to look at this in terms of important things that have happened throughout time. And so our discussion of geologic time will really be relative. Actually, we're going to talk about this had to happen in order for this to happen, right? So you had to get cells. Well, first you have to get RNA, right? And macromolecules. Those have to be able to organize themselves into cells. Those cells have to be able to communicate in mass to form complex bodies. Those complex bodies have to occur in certain structures and have to have certain structures and have to do certain things, right? Like going from water to land. That is a milestone, right? And then as we start to see these traits, and that's how we're going to go from the simplest life to humans by the end of this course. Okay, and here actually are some really important milestones. So I would check these out and think about, okay, what had to happen first? Because we're going to think about it logically. Obviously, lungs have to come after coming out of the ocean, right? Seems really important. A spine has to, well, a spinal cord has to come before a spinal column, right? Okay, so here is your first mini quiz question. So remember, throughout the video notes there will be mini quiz questions which you will have when you come into class next time. Here's your first one. There is no disagreement about the divisions of time. This is actually false, right? Divisions of time historically are based on fossils and major events like extinctions. Okay, and so some people disagree, and it's possible that sometimes these time periods might change if you find that you've made mistakes or if things don't line up, right? And so there's debate about it, just like everything in science. Nothing in science is solidified 100%, right? There's always that certain amount of uncertainty, and you don't really know if a prediction that you've made is true until it happens, right? All right, and we'll talk about this more later on. Now, one of the other things that's really important to know is that continents move throughout time, and this is another thing that we use to understand the history of the Earth, right? So we see what was living there, and we can actually use fossils, not just to determine time periods, but we can use fossils to determine where the continents may have been at any given time throughout history. And plate tectonics is actually really important for a lot of reasons. We are going to talk about it just in terms of the fact that they move, and what evidence we have to let us know that they move. But remember, lots of natural disasters are actually caused by plate tectonics. All the earthy ones like tsunamis and earthquakes, volcanoes, right, have to do with the fact that you have a mantle. So these things that actually have a huge impact sometimes on mass extinctions, right? One of the mass extinctions is actually because the Siberian traps erupt, right, and create mass catastrophe. So plate tectonics actually has a huge impact on human history. That is not something that we're really going to address in this class. We're just interested in how we know that things move. So just to give you an idea, when we're looking at 430 million years ago, about 100 million years after the Cambrian explosion, which is a big key milestone. We'll talk about it more later, Cambrian explosion. So then they just start shifting around, and eventually you get to, after the Permian, by the way, massive extinction, right? The largest extinction in history. And then we keep moving. We get Pangea, which is super famous. Yay, right? This is dinosaur town. Yay, right? Jurassic, Cretaceous. And then eventually we get to where the continents are today, and they will move again, right? Because, true or false, the continents are in their final positions and will remain there. I just gave you the answer. That is false, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of these evolutionary milestones. And remember, I told you that that's how we're going to think about geologic time, okay? So the theory of evolution is actually fundamental to all biology. And the idea of evolution actually existed before Darwin. He just happens to be the person who made this really beautiful argument for how and why things change over time, specifically within a species. But Alfred Russel Wallace talks about other species and how they interact with each other, and we're going to talk about all of these things. But essentially what we know happens is that organisms, for the most part, change slowly over time. This is called gradualism, right? Gradualism. Occasionally you'll have some like really abrupt change. That is called punctuated equilibrium, right? This abrupt change. And as we're going to look at when we look at the rare earth theory, an enormous amount of time has to pass in order for complex life to evolve, okay? Now, the theory of evolution is really talking about change, and when you talk about change in a physiological sense, you're really talking about changes in genes, and that will be the conversation of the second unit, is how genes work, because evolution works because genes change, right? And that's how that happens. Okay, so some big milestones that you want to know. Obviously, cells are the first one. I already mentioned those. Multicellularity, the ability of cells to work together to form tissues. Then having, now on the line of humans, if we were looking at some other organism, we might pick a different kind of pathway. But when you are looking at humans in particular, bilateral symmetry, the right and the left are the same. Having cavities inside the body, that's called the coelom, right? That's going to be your digestive system, your lungs, stuff like that, where they are, not the actual cavities, but where they actually are. Segmentation, that's what allows you to have that great vertebral column. Jointed appendages, arms and legs that like bend. Deuterosomes, these are animals who have a mouth and an other opening, right? So we have that sort of digestive canal kind of situation, tract. That's pretty exciting. And then the notochord is the precursor to the spinal cord. Really, really important. So these are some things that you want to keep in mind. Also, sexual reproduction. This is the driving force behind evolution. The fact that you have mixes of genes in offspring. Right? Now, sexual reproduction results in new genes in a population. Is that true or false? That's actually false, and we'll talk about why later on. New genes only come about because of mutations, right? Sexual reproduction results in a jumbling of the genes, and so you get sort of a new mix of genes, but you don't actually get brand new genes from it. And I love this picture, by the way. These two little piglets are born of feral hogs, which are a huge invasive species here in the United States, especially in the South. But this one is a cute little domesticated looking piggy, and this one is a full-on wild boar. pig, right? And it just goes to show you that you can get wide variety with genes. And we'll actually talk about a little bit about why this happens when we talk about genes later on and unintended consequences and stuff. Okay, so about 430 million years ago, plants and animals leave the oceans to populate the land. So when we were talking about milestones, the Cambrian explosion 543 million years ago is the first really big time period that we want to mark. It's at this point when all body plans that you see today evolve in a very short period of time. You get this explosion of life. It's all in the ocean, and for the next 100 million years or so, we're going to be in the ocean. But every body plan that you see today evolved in that time period, okay? Now, about 430 million years ago, we take the steps onto the beach, right? We become more acquainted and comfortable with land, and that's very exciting, right? Also, we want to look at the first vertebrates, okay? This is a big deal. This happens in the Cambrian explosion. They're not bony, by the way. We don't get bony stuff until right before we leave. About the same time that we move on to land, we start to see bones, right? That's when the first bony fish show up. But our first vertebrates come out of the Cambrian explosion 100 million years ago. Then we get on land. It's when we start getting bones, right? That's our first bony fish. The next big thing that we want are the first reptiles. Now, amphibians actually evolved before that. Tetrapod is a real big deal, that four-leg kind of thing, as opposed to fins. That's a big deal. But the reptiles are going to give rise to dinosaurs, mammals, and birds. So they're a really significant group. They do evolve from amphibians, but they're kind of our big guy. Okay, tetrapods I just talked about. That's legs and stuff. Yay, we like legs. Then we want to talk about in the line to humans, right? If we were talking about the line to chickens, we'd be talking about dinosaurs and birds. But in the line to humans, the next big step from reptiles is mammals, right? Really important, okay? Then just as a side note and offshoot, we see the first birds. In our line to human evolution, that's actually not directly significant, but then again, we have a very close relationship with birds, so I just thought I'd point it out. The first primates are going to be the next big one. Okay, and then we'll go from there later on. All right, so birds and mammals arise from reptiles. This is a review question. This is true, right? Birds and mammals do arise from reptiles, as do dinosaurs, okay? I actually love this picture, not because it's in any way physiologically accurate, but the last remaining relative of the T-Rex, the great and mighty T-Rex, is the awesome chicken. Yay! Okay, so this is what we were talking about. We have our mammals. Here's the thing. I just want to point out, this is like 65 million years ago, mammals begin to predominate. That is when the dinosaurs go extinct 65 million years ago. But here's the thing about that. Mammals actually evolve way before that. Mammals are evolving at least 220 million years ago. And so mammals have actually been around for over 200 million years, but they were tiny and they were, nocturnal, and they weren't really exciting because dinosaurs were it. I mean, they were the dominant force on the planet. When they go extinct, mammals become the dominant force on the planet, and then we have a really interesting story about our rise to dominance. About 6 million years ago, that date is arguable, and we'll talk about how it's arguable later on. We see the first hominins, Homo sapiens. Now, I actually forgot to change this, and I apologize for that, but Homo sapiens, we got new evidence last year that Homo sapiens may in fact be 350,000 years old. So this 150,000 was based on some genetic data, which has since been refined, but then we have some fossil evidence that's putting us around 3 to 350,000 years. So I will change this maybe on the PowerPoint. I need you to change it on your PowerPoint, okay? So put that at 300 to 350,000 years ago. And of course, we'll talk about more of that later on, because what about all these guys? Yay, because they're all apes too. Okay, now we're going to shift our thought. This is just kind of an overview of how we organize stuff and what the important stuff in that organization is for this course. So this is kind of like an intro, but I do want to talk about classification because this is a really important concept in biology. Why do we classify things? I already told you. We need a system to make sense of what we see. We have lots of information, and in order to really understand it, we have to organize it first. Now, the goal of any classification system is to organize groups not just arbitrarily, right, but into groups that have biological meaning, and that is good for a couple of reasons. One, it makes it easier to find information, right? If you think, okay, well, I know that all cats are going to be in here in this group, that's great. You know where to look. But what happens when you find a new organism? It makes it easier if you have biologically meaningful categories. You can identify and place new organisms in a much easier and more universally agreeable way, right? The other thing that it does is it shows evolutionary relationships, and that's important. And there are two parts of classification. There's taxonomy and systematics. And taxonomy is simply naming stuff, right? You identify it, right? Then you arrange it into groups and then you name it. And the nomenclature is the naming part. So identifying, classifying, naming are the three parts of taxonomy. And the father of modern classification is Carolus Linnaeus. Carl von Linné was actually his name. He liked a system of binomial nomenclature so much that he named himself after it, which I think is very cool. This is what you're really familiar with. It's a set of taxa, right? Each taxon is a level of organization. So you start out with really broad categories. You know them. The ones you probably learned were kingdom. We're going to talk about that in a second. And then you go all the way down to species, right? And that's the most exclusive group. So when we talk about this, we start out with domains. These are really big. They're based on ribosomal DNA, right? Actually, they're based on ribosomal RNA. Just kidding, not DNA. They're based on ribosomal RNA. And so we've got three big categories. These are all bacteria, single-celled guys. Eukarya, most everything that we're going to talk about is going to be in the eukarya group, okay? Then kingdom. This is probably something you've seen before, Animalia, Plantae, fungi. And then we move down into orders and things like that. I put this in here because it will give you a good sense when we start talking about cells and cell structures about what differentiates these groups, because a lot of it is based on the cell type and cell structures that you find there, okay? All right, so viruses are not on that list. Why not? Viruses are not classified in a kingdom because they are not well understood, they're too small, their genetics are unknown, or they're not organisms. Viruses have their own classification system because they are not organisms. They are not alive. Viruses are not alive, right? I know that's a hard thing to kind of accept, but we will talk about why viruses are not actually organisms later on. We understand many of them very well. They are very tiny, but lots of things are tiny. We know a lot about virus genetics. Actually, we use viruses, the virus genetics, to do a lot of biotech stuff, and we'll talk about how that works later on. So it's none of that. It's just that they're not alive. That's it. They're not alive, and our classification system is for living stuff. All right, so modern classification is domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And over here you can see us. We are eukarya is our domain, Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, primates, Hominidae, Homo sapiens. Now it's very important to note that the species is actually always written as the genus and species. Genus and everything above it are capitalized. Species is lowercase. Genus and everything above it is capitalized. Species name is lowercase. So it would be capital H, Homo, lowercase s, sapiens. And in typing, binomial nomenclature is always italicized. In typing, binomial nomenclature is always italicized. So you're saying to yourself right now, oh my gosh, how am I going to remember all of this? Does Keek Phillip come over for great spaghetti? There is your little mnemonic device. Yay. Okay, so binomial nomenclature is the scientific name, and all species are identified by their genus and species, and that's a very important thing. So think about the cougar, right? So why do we need this binomial nomenclature? Well, this is a cougar, right? That is a puma. That is a panther. That is a mountain lion. And that is a catamount with a kit. Cub, not kit, sorry. That's something else. Cubs. Here's the thing. With all these common names, you might think that these are different animals because they're different common names. They're not. They're all puma concolor, and they're all the same species. They're all the same animal, but different people in different regions call them different things, right? And so we need to be able to know, aside from what people have developed as names, what are we really talking about? And so binomial nomenclature is universally accepted by everybody, in theory. Okay. So it is unique to each species, regardless of the common name. And that's very important because here's another example, right? What does a robin look like? That's a robin. Well, not everywhere. This is the Turdus migratorius is our robin. That is also a robin, but that is not the same bird. This is also a robin. Also not the same bird. And there's actually a robin that's blue and yellow. That's also not the same bird. Oh, Patroika phoenicia should actually be italicized. That's a mistake on my part. I didn't even catch that. But that should be italicized, so make sure you pay attention to that. Okay, so species. What does that mean? Which of the following is the best definition of species? Are they similar individuals that live together? A group of similar individuals that interact and interbreed with one another to produce viable offspring? All plants, animals, and microbes? Organisms interact among themselves and their surroundings to maintain the ecosystem? Or organisms that are recognizably the same? Well, there's a couple of different definitions of species, and we will talk about them later on. You've got the phylogenetic definition, you've got the biological definition, but essentially what everyone agrees to is that a group of individuals that can produce viable offspring in the wild on a regular basis, they are the same species, right? And so there's some real flaws with that, and that is these guys are actually different species, right? But they're the same mouse. That's tricky. Right? They look the same, but there's 6 different species of mosquito here in Texas, or in North Texas, and they all look identical to each other except one that has stripes, or 2 that have stripes. But they pretty much look the same, but they're different species. And so it's about genetics and it's about the ability to breed. And we will talk about this more later on. This is a very messy definition, so we're not going to get super hung up on it because those guys are all the same species too. Like all dogs are the same species, but they clearly look different. So how does that work? So this gets a little bit of a mess. We'll talk about it more later. All right, but essentially, classification systems work because there's a set of traits. We put all of the organisms that have those traits into that group, and then as you move down, does King Philip come over for Great Spaghetti, you get more and more exclusive, right? Until each species only has one type of organism in it, right? So this is for the black bear, right? Ursus americanus. And you can see there's a lot of stuff in eukarya. Then we start narrowing it down as we go through, okay? All right, and then just here's one for, this is a domestic cat. By the way, Felis domestica is the old name for cat. It's now Felis catus. Right, and so the modern name for a domestic cat is Felis catus. So the reason I put this in here is so that you can see that things change over time, right? Sometimes we rename stuff because we learn more about it. We learned that cats are not actually domesticated. We'll talk about what that means later on. So when we decided they weren't domesticated, we changed their name. Doesn't mean they don't live in your house. It just means they're not domesticated, like dogs are. Okay, the taxon consisting of the most closely related species is the family, genus, order, or class. Well, genus is down here, has way fewer characteristics, so the most closely related is the genus, right? So everybody who's in the same genus, all those species in the same genus will be more closely related, right? So domestic cat, and this little guy right here, I think this is a, I don't know what that is. Here's a leopard, right? But these guys are more closely related than these guys. And these guys are more closely related to each other than they are to these guys. Does this make sense? Okay. Again, we're grouped by traits, and it works for plants too. Plants, fungi, bacteria, whatever. Everything has a classification system. So the classification system phenotypic is based on phenotypic and molecular similarities. So true or false, those similarities are based on evolutionary relationships. Is true. They are based on evolutionary relationships typically. Now, you will get some exceptions to that. For the most part, though, when we talk about classifying stuff, we want to classify it by phylogenetic relationships. This is the evolutionary lineage, essentially, is what we're doing. The higher the level of the taxon, so say kingdom, right, versus genus, the further back in time the common ancestor is. So when you look at that cascade from domain to species, you're also walking through time as thinking about when everything splits off from everything else. And this is really one of the hearts of this class. Well, there's only one heart in anything, but this is part of the heart of this class. Okay, and it turns out that organisms that are very similar may actually not share a common ancestor. And a really good example is this, right? You have a crab, a barnacle, and a limpet. When you look at a barnacle and a limpet, if you categorize them based on appearance, they're going to be in the same group because they both have conical shells, and crabs look nothing like them. But when you start looking at genes and actual traits, like real traits, besides just the way they look, you'll find out that barnacles are actually crustaceans, and they are much more closely related to crabs than they are to limpets, which are mollusks, and have a different origin of that conical structure. Barnacles have a different life cycle and all of this good stuff, okay? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about modern evolutionary classification. So traditionally you'd get this cute little evolutionary tree, and we will use these, and they kind of illustrate time. This thing broke off before that thing. Oh, wait, no. When we look at some of these classification things, we're actually not looking at time. When we talk about evolutionary trees, we're really only talking about relationships, because it would be crazy to say that mammals broke off of reptiles before, or would it, right? Would it? You want to be careful about time. Only think about time on a tree when you talk about, like, if it's actually stated that has happened. Okay, and so when we look at these, we're really just looking at relationships. And so an easier way to draw this so you can see relationships is to actually line them up by trait. And so what we do now is we actually use cladograms. And I'm showing these to you because we're going to reference them in the class, and so this may be a little bit confusing right now, but it will become clearer as we move through the course, okay? So again, you may see things like this, but it's easier to understand the traits that they share if you do a cladogram, right? And so there's a trait here, everybody's got it. There's a trait here, everybody afterwards has got it. There's a trait here, everybody afterwards has got it. There's a trait here, everybody afterwards has got it, okay? All right, and here is a phylogenetic tree of life in general. This is our branch. Here we are right here. Yay, us. Okay, this is just another way to represent that. And so here you have humans are more closely related to mice than they are to dogs. There's a common ancestor between humans and mice. There's a common ancestor between dogs and the common ancestor of human and mice. There's a common ancestor between this common ancestor and that common ancestor, and that's how it works. It's just another way to show evolutionary relationships. And again, I'm just showing it to you now. We'll use them more later. Now here's the catch though. Phylogenetic trees are actually hypotheses, right? It depends on the traits that you use. It depends on which traits you think are earlier or later. It depends on if you think those traits arise after a split or before a split. And this is what I mean, right? So let's say that you have 9 traits, right? In this case, whales have 2 through 9, right? Whereas tuna and whales share 1. If you make tuna and whale related because they both live in the ocean, then you also have to have 2 through 9 to address the fact that lizards, monkeys, and hippopotamuses have those too, right? Well, lizards don't have 6 through 9, but they have 2 through 5. So this hypothesizes a relationship where whale and tuna are more closely related than whale are to lizards, monkeys, and hippopotamuses, right? this is not the best hypothesis, right? It is more likely that all of these traits that these guys share arose in these groups, and that whales are in fact not closely related to tuna. They're more closely related to the hippopotamus than they are to anything else. And that makes more sense because we get what's called parsimony, right? The most parsimonious trees are the ones that have the least repetition of traits, okay? And again, we'll talk about this more later on. But a phylogeny is simply a hypothesis. The cleaner it is, the more things that you have to finagle, like this is real clean, right? This is kind of a mess. The more things that you have to do that way, the less likely it is to be true. Okay. Now, what happens when new data is discovered? Like any other hypothesis, right? It's just a hypothesis. So what happens? Well, the phylogenies may change. They may not change. It depends. For a while, the little red panda was a raccoon because he looks very raccoony. For a while, giant pandas and red pandas were in the same group together. But it turns out red pandas are their own thing and giant pandas are bears. So, things have changed for these guys organization-wise. Now, that also goes to the idea that organization systems are a little bit arbitrary, right? We like to think that they make sense, but we do make them up, right? And so they can change. And then the last thing, really quickly, is that we can use these genetic changes that we separate, that are used to separate organisms into groups. We can also use them to date those species. Like, how old is a species? Like, polar bears are probably around 200,000 years old. How do I know that? We look at the genes, and this is something we will talk about more when we talk about genetics and DNA and mutations and stuff like that in the second unit. Okay. So this is probably one of the longest video notes that you'll have, and it's because there was a lot of information in it. Thank you for listening. Please make sure that you wrote down any questions that you had, and you're going to ask them in class next time, because at the beginning of class I will call for questions, and I will see you next time. Don't forget you'll have a mini quiz.